Welcome everyone. Welcome to City University of London and the launch of the 2018 Global Nutrition Report. It's fantastic to have you here with us this afternoon. My name is Corinna Hawkes. I'm Director of the Centre for Food Policy at City University of London, as well as the co-chair of the Global Nutrition Report. We are part of the Department of Sociology in the School of Arts and Social Sciences in the University, and on behalf of all the staff, I would like to give you a warm welcome to the University. This event is part of the Centre for Food Policy Food Thinkers series. It's our Christmas special, and it's delightful for me to combine my roles at the Centre for Food Policy and in the Global Nutrition Report to host this launch here this evening. And I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to have with us from the UK Government the Right Honourable Alistair Burt, MP, the Minister of International Development. Welcome and thank you very much for coming. So we're going to start then with Minister Burt going to give an address around the state of global nutrition. Then I will give a 10-15 minutes overview of the Global Nutrition Report. I'm then delighted to welcome Joanna Ralston, who is the CEO of the World Obesity Federation, and Gwen Hines, who is Executive Director of Global Programmes of the Save the Children Fund, who will form a panel and we'll have some discussion, but we'll open it out to the floor so we can have an interactive discussion about the findings of the report. This event is being live streamed as we speak. And if you would like to share any thoughts or comments with the wider world through social media, feel free to do so. And there's a couple of hashtags you can see there. So welcome everybody. And with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Minister Burt. Let's put some behind here. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's great to see so many people here for this. So thank you all very much for breaking away from whatever you would have been doing up to now, and apologies that I have to leave fairly shortly after the speech, but I will listen to the conclusions and the main headlines from the nutrition report that's so important to all of us. So thank you for that. Ensuring everyone gets the basic nutrition they need is one of the most fundamental obligations we owe each other as human beings. We're here today because this report highlights that across the world we're not doing enough. As we are at the UK launch of the report, let me recognise first that malnutrition in all its forms continues to burden the health and well-being of children in the UK as well. In England, more than 1 in 5 children are overweight or obese before they start primary school, rising to over a third by the time they leave. This burden is felt hardest in the most deprived areas. And what the government is doing to address this, in June we published the second chapter of our childhood obesity plan, which outlines our ambition to halve childhood obesity and significantly reduce the gap in obesity between children from the most and the least deprived areas by 2030. Key measures in this chapter include looking to address the heavy promotion and advertising of food and drink products high in fat, salt and sugar on TV, online, and of course in those dodgy catchment areas in the shops. We've already seen some important successes since the publication of Chapter 1 of our plan in 2016. For example, over half of products in scope of soft drinks industry levy have been reformulated, the equivalent of removing some 45 million kilograms of sugar every year. Looking beyond our shores, however, problems of the world are rather different. I'm closely focused on Yemen, as Minister in the Foreign Office, as well as in DFID. In that country and elsewhere, we're confronted with the most harrowing images of starving people, which should simply not be conceivable in the 21st century. The United Kingdom is doing what it can to save lives in emergency contexts like these. In October, we announced a new package of almost £100 million to address malnutrition there, and we're working hard to ensure that other countries and international bodies act to stop innocent people dying from malnutrition. I chaired the call to action at the United Nations General Assembly in September to do just that, putting nutrition absolutely on the front line. But as the report makes clear, the kind of malnutrition we see in places like Yemen is actually just the tip of a much wider global challenge. I won't rehearse the figures, they speak for themselves and they're set out in the report. But rather I'd like to set out why tackling global malnutrition is a key priority for the UK government, and why I believe it should be a key priority for every government, and indeed for every multilateral organisation, company and civil society organisation. Tackling malnutrition is a key priority for us because we know that beyond the immediate threat to life, the effects of hunger and malnutrition are devastating and long-lasting. When children are denied at the very beginning of their life the proper nutrition their bodies and minds need to grow to their full potential, they can't get this time back. We know that the long-term effects of acute malnutrition can be profound. Just one episode can have lifelong impacts on the growth and development of the young children who survive. Individuals have been robbed of their potential, but so also are their countries. A 40% reduction in stunting by 2025 could, for example, add some $83 billion, it's estimated, to national incomes in Africa from 2035 through to 2060. The World Bank's Human Capital Index, published in October, helpfully demonstrates just what an impact a malnourished population has on the productivity of countries' workforces. Across much of the developing world, prime ministers and finance ministers now have clear facts in front of them that show just how much productivity their country is losing, not to mention the human dimension and human impact. My Secretary of State, Penny Mordaunt, has taken on the role of human capital champion and is committed to landing the clear message with all our counterparts that investing in better nutrition and other key elements of human capital is fundamental to economic growth and poverty reduction, and that we would expect all governments who can afford to do so to invest more and more effectively. In summary, tackling malnutrition saves lives, builds people's resilience, and helps deliver the prosperity that's needed in so many areas where demographics are going to become increasingly important in the years to come. And I think it's why it's important to the UK government. It's why we've been global leaders on this. It's why we're delivering all the commitments we made in London 2013, and why we're well on track to reach 50 million people with our programmes by 2020. And it's why our commitment to nutrition is firm and enduring. The facts in today's report don't make for easy reading. It's shocking and unacceptable that globally we're substantially off track to reach the target on eliminating malnutrition in Sustainable Development Goals. But I don't find the report to be depressing per se. I see it as a cause for hope, because compared to where we were 5 years ago at the first Global Nutrition Summit in London, a lot of important building blocks have been put in place, and because we know a lot better what needs to be done. Let me give you a few examples. We have the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition in place, providing an overall framework for our response. We have, under the leadership of Gerda Verberg, an expanded Scaling Up Nutrition movement, supporting governments to develop effective nutrition plans of their own. We have the World Bank's investment framework that sets out the cost of achieving the global nutrition targets. We have the first ever innovative financing facility for nutrition that leverages resources from the private sector. The Power of Nutrition, up and running here in London, is that particular facility. With DFID support of £42.5 million to date, it's already funded programmes worth over £270 million. We have a global panel on food systems in place, and its foresight report on food systems and diet. And we have in the Global Nutrition Report and Access to Nutrition Index strong tools to hold all partners to account. I'm proud to say that DFID has supported each and every one of these developments, either financially or politically. We do this because we know that tackling malnutrition is one of the most cost-effective investments we can make. And while we need many more partners to step up, I'm greatly encouraged by the leadership the government of Japan has shown by committing to convene the next Global Nutrition Summit in Japan in 2020. Our Japanese colleagues are clear that they want a summit that has a high level of ambition. They want it to generate substantial, meaningful policy and financial commitments to nutrition that will get us back on track to achieve the SDG target. So I hope each and every one of you can work with Japan so that this level of ambition can indeed be realised. So those are some of the building blocks we now have in place. As I said, we also now have a much clearer sense of what needs to be done. The report sets it out well. And let me focus on two issues that I think are of particular importance. The first is food systems. I fear that to date we've not collectively grasped this as well as we should. The bottom line is that for many, many poor people, food systems are simply not providing them with nutritious foods they can afford, but they are increasingly providing access to cheap processed food with little nutritional value. It's not a side issue. It's one of the most fundamental barriers there is to ending malnutrition in all its forms, as the report makes clear. Some things have been done, like food fortification and workplace nutrition improvement. These are legitimate enough, but are never alone going to be able to shift the dial. Sometimes very valid concerns, which I absolutely share, around engaging with certain types of companies have got in the way of meaningfully engaging the rest of the private sector, without which we're not going to make real progress. The question now is what we're all going to do to deliver better food systems. For my part, I approved earlier this year a new DFID programme, which will focus specifically on this. The second issue I'd like to highlight is simply the way we're all working together in the Scaling Up Nutrition movement. If we look, for example, at the way we currently address acute malnutrition in fragile countries, I think it's clear we could do considerably better. Too often we're still responding to protracted nutrition crises with short-term humanitarian financing. It's not good value for money. It's not consistent and reliable. It's not breaking the cycle of vulnerability, and it's not helping governments get to a point when they can start to deliver any of this themselves. I'm encouraged to see that our UN colleagues are thinking about how some of the old issues of fragmented mandates can be overcome to address this. We need to progress this fast, and the UK again is willing to be a partner in all this. So, ladies and gentlemen, when we're confronted with desperate situations, we know how we can work together more effectively. I was hugely encouraged by the way so many of us came together when we had to around the Yemen call to action that I referred to earlier. What we all need to do now is take that spirit and apply it right across the rest of our work on global malnutrition. The UK is committed to doing so. My closing ask is that you take all the evidence and analysis in this excellent report and use it to galvanise the leaders of your own organisations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that inspiring address and the support that the UK government is providing to global nutrition, which is well known in the international nutrition community to be extensive. So thank you for your support, and thanks for your words about the report and in understanding the importance of this issue and the size of this issue and the importance of this issue. So thank you very much. Now, the Global Nutrition Report. The Global Nutrition Report has a very clear purpose. Its purpose is to collate, analyse and communicate data with the goal of accelerating action to address malnutrition in all its forms. And this is the 5th report in 2018. And each one has used data in different ways. And this year, our purpose was to use data to shine a light on where there has been progress in ending malnutrition in all its forms, the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal, and where there has not been progress. And we delve into a range of issues around the nature of the burden of malnutrition. We highlight the issue among adolescents of micronutrient deficiencies and of conflict. We highlight how much progress there has been in political commitments and financing, and throughout the report we have spotlights that highlight areas of progress in policies and actions taken to address it. And we also, for the first time, include a chapter on diets, what people eat and why it matters. And I will be focusing my remarks this evening and the data this evening that I will present on that. The first point I would like to make is just how much the report this year shows how malnutrition is a universal problem. Let me explain. First of all, we know, has already been indicated, that the global burden of malnutrition is unacceptably high. This is stunting when children don't grow properly. It is wasting when they are underweight. It's obesity among all age groups, it's micronutrient deficiencies, it's thinness among women. We have these many different forms of malnutrition. And we know that they are a cause of death and disease and ill health. And we also know, and I wanted to point this out right at the start, just how unfortunate, to use a polite term, it is that the level of conflict and fragility and the effects of environmental change are making our efforts to address malnutrition so much harder, with a much higher proportion of children in conflict states affected by stunting than others. But there is some good news, and we highlight all the progress we can throughout the report when we can. And the first one is that stunting is declining. It's declined by millions and millions of children since 2000. That is very, very good news. The other good news is that when you look at whether countries are actually achieving the targets that the world has set itself for nutrition, almost 50% are achieving one. Now that could be glass half full, it could be glass half empty. But let's take the good side of that. We are achieving some goals. These targets were adopted by the member states of the World Health Organization in 2012 in one resolution, in 2013 in another resolution. And what the Global Nutrition Report is to track progress against all of these targets, which you can see include stunting, anemia, low birth weight, exclusive breastfeeding, wasting, salt, blood pressure, and obesity and diabetes. So we bring together all of these different forms of malnutrition. But despite this progress, the progress is essentially too slow to achieve the targets that the world has set itself. That's particularly noticeable for anemia and for obesity. But it's the same for pretty much all of these targets. Even for childhood stunting, where we've seen so much progress, we are nevertheless off course of reaching 100 million children stunted by 2025, which is the target. At current rates of progress, we will not attain that target. And we shine the spotlight on women this year, and we show that when you look at the malnutrition that women experience, just how slow the progress has been. Prevalence of anemia has scarcely changed since 2000 as an indicator of micronutrient deficiency. Prevalence of underweight has gone down, but not by very much at all. And all of this time, overweight and obesity is rising among women. So we bring together these different forms of malnutrition and ask the question, do countries just have one form of malnutrition? Is it that childhood underweight is a problem in one country and stunting is a problem in another and obesity is a problem in another? Micronutrient deficiency is a problem in other countries? No. By bringing that data together, we find that 88% of countries for which we have data on these three different forms of malnutrition face overlapping burdens. So that means that countries have not just one form of malnutrition to deal with, but several. And we identified 41 countries that experience overweight, anemia, and stunting all together at the same time. And we drill down even further using some UNICEF data. And we asked the question, do individuals experience more than one form of malnutrition? And the answer is yes. We have children, young children, who experience both stunting and wasting. So they are both stunted growth and they haven't grown properly in the early years of life, and they are underweight, which of course leads to greater incidence of mortality among those populations. And we also see children who are stunted and overweight at the same time. So they have not been sufficiently nourished, they haven't grown properly, and yet they are consuming too many calories. Now, we know from the data that the majority of countries that face these overlapping burdens are in Africa. And Africa is the region of the world that faces so many problems that it's important to point that out. But it's also important to point out that countries like the UK are not exceptions. We hear a lot, and Minister Burke pointed this out, about obesity in this country, which is a serious problem among both children and adults. But it's not just that. We know that millions of elderly people experience undernutrition. We know that adolescent girls are not consuming enough micronutrients. Up to 54% are not consuming what the government considers sufficient for a healthy diet for iron. And we know that 10.1% of our population lives in households where adults report insecure access to food, and often these households have to go and have emergency food provision from food banks. So in the UK, we also have this overlapping burden of different forms of malnutrition. And that just serves to indicate what a universal problem malnutrition is. And our analysis shows that every country in the world is affected by malnutrition. This is not a rich world, poor world. This is everybody that is affected by this problem. And one of the reasons for that is the universal nature of poor quality diets. And in the Global Nutrition Report, as a result of the evidence, as a result of the data that we show in this year's report, we are not afraid to say that we consider this circumstance unacceptable. First of all, diets that are inadequate in nutritious foods. Foods like whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, fish, fibre, legumes, beans. We present data that clearly shows that if we don't consume enough of these foods, we are more likely to lose healthy years of life through heart disease, to cancers, and to diabetes. But we also know that young children who don't have these nutritious foods are more likely to be stunted. And yet, we show data that 74.6% of children of countries where we have data under the age of 2 do not have sufficient dietary diversity for a healthy diet. Now, if you are a poor child, you are more likely not to have a diverse diet. But we still have 56.7% of children in the highest wealth quintile not consuming sufficient dietary diversity for a healthy diet. By drilling down into this data and by looking at the wealth quintiles and looking at the urban and rural difference, we find that all this problem is widespread among all of these different groups. So it's a problem for adults, for disease, it's a problem for children, for stunting, and that comes together. And one of the reasons for this, in this fascinating data set that we were privileged to share from the World Food Programme from the Fill the Nutrient Gap tool, we show that within countries there are areas where people simply cannot afford a nutritious diet. And we show this throughout the report, different areas where we drill down and look within countries, and at the subnational level, at the local level, at the city level, and urban-rural, where we show there are these differences within countries. And that's what this slide shows, that there's a big range that within countries, sometimes 85% of people can afford a nutritious diet, and other parts of the countries it's much, much lower than that. But the main message is that there are many people who can't afford a nutritious diet, and it's exactly the same here in the UK. They were much, much poorer, lower middle income countries, where the latest analysis from the Food Foundation shows that for the country's poorest people, that it would cost them 74% of their income to afford a nutritious diet. And even for the income group up from that, it would cost 30% of their income to afford a nutritious diet. So this is a problem everywhere. Now, the good news on diet, and we include breastfeeding on diet, is exclusive breastfeeding. We've seen the data on exclusive breastfeeding creep up over the years, and the target for exclusive breastfeeding that we track against is at least 50% prevalence rate of exclusive breastfeeding in the first 6 months. And we're at 41%, and that means that it's the only target where we can say it's some progress rather than no progress. And we highlight some really exciting examples that shows that with really committed, concerted action at the national level or at the community level, you really can make a difference in this area. And these two examples from Burkina Faso and Nepal indicate that. So that's really exciting. But for the first year too, we also show commercial sales data. And we look at packaged foods, and we include in that infant formula and follow-up formula. So infant formula for 0 to 6 months, and follow-up formulas and follow-up milks for when older than 6 months. With the exception of North America, we find unprecedented increase in sales of these products. And the trouble with that is that we know that the best solution at this age is breastfeeding and extended breastfeeding and a diverse diet at the complementary feeding stage. So this is not good news. We also shine a spotlight on adolescents, showing that up to 33% of school-aged children eat no fruit on a daily basis. And yet, up to 59% of them are consuming soda. And from this packaged foods data that we look at, we show that packaged foods sales are either high or increasing everywhere in the world. And that would be absolutely fine if industrially processed manufactured foods were aligned with a healthy diet. But we add on to that another level of analysis of over 23,000 packaged foods, which shows that 69% of them from a range of different countries are not aligned with a healthy diet. And we show that the proportion which are not aligned with a healthy diet is higher in the low and middle income countries, So in the UK, we're at the average of 69%. New Zealand is doing best on 63%. But in China, 87% of the packaged foods in this very comprehensive data set are actually defined as not being healthy. So when you look at the UK then about what we're eating, 69% of those industrially processed packaged foods are not aligned with healthy diets. Only 8% of UK teenagers are meeting the 5-a-day recommendations. Children under the age of 3 are consuming 11.3% of their calories from sugar, more than double recommendations. Adults are eating far less dietary fibre than they should, and all age groups are not eating enough oily fish. The only one that we're really meeting is women's intake of meat, and there may be some people who consider that is not a good one to be meeting. And in fact, men exceed their recommended intake of meat as well. So I won't deny that this data indicates the situation is pretty diabolical. But what the report shows through the examples it gives and the other data it presents in these examples is that it is not wrong to say, and Minister made this point very, very well, that the opportunity has never been greater to affect change. And that's because we know so much more. We highlight some really exciting examples in the report of how more and more data is being collected, collated and analysed. We show, for example, data from the Global Dietary Database. We highlight how the UN agencies are beginning to collect data better. We highlight civil society initiatives such as Informus, the initiative by researchers, some very exciting work such as this one here, Co-Create, but there were many other examples in the report about we are filling the data gaps with diet, which has been such a problematic area with regard to getting new data. So in a year and 2 years' time, we will know even more about what people are eating and therefore diagnose what we can actually do about it. It's not just progress in data, it's progress in really understanding what we can do. And these are just 4 examples of what we highlight in the report as areas where we have learned so many things now about what it takes to affect change. Fortification was already mentioned, but it's at the government level, it's at the city level, and it's at the community level. And all of these levels are showing where we can identify areas of effective change. According to the World Health Organization, almost 59% of countries have imposed taxes on sugary drinks, not all of which are to do with health, but many of which are. We see some really exciting initiatives at the city level, which we highlight, and at the local level, where we're beginning to see obesity go down, and at the community level, we identify examples where you've seen incredibly rapid change as a result of intensive, multi-layered activity. And echoing what the Minister just said, we know that it's bringing these actions together and really galvanizing and multi-level concerted action that can really affect change. So I would argue then, and the Global Nutrition Report is an accountability report, it is meant to incentivize and accelerate action and make people feel a little uncomfortable. And what I've shown this afternoon is that there has been progress, and we celebrate that. But we have a long way to go. But what we show through our data in the report this year is just how much more we know than before. And so when I was working with my colleague Jess Fanzo, who is unfortunately not able to be here tonight due to illness, the question that kept on going through my mind is not so much why are things so bad, but why are things not better when our knowledge, when we know so much more than before. So how are we going to convert that then into real change? We identify 5 critical steps that really need to happen. These are not new things. These are not things that have not been said before, but they are the things that really need to change if we are going to affect change into the future. And I'll highlight just a couple of them. The first one is about breaking down silos between different forms of malnutrition. We have a tendency to say, okay, I work on wasted children in a conflict situation, and I look at short-term change, or I look at development issues and I look at stunting, or I work on obesity, or I work on micronutrient deficiencies, kind of working separately. We argue that unless we bring these different forms of malnutrition together and look at it as one nutrition, we won't really get to where we need to get to, because we'll be so much more of a powerful community, but also we'll be focused more on those underlying causes. And one of those causes, of course, is diets. And if we don't focus and galvanise concerted action on diets, we simply won't end malnutrition in all its forms by 2030, as the Sustainable Development Goals call on us to do. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'd welcome my panel this evening. As I said, my co-chair, Professor Jessica Fanzo, unfortunately, who normally manages to stay standing through thick and thin, is so unwell tonight she's not able to join us. But I'm delighted to welcome Joanna Ralston and Gwen Hines, as I introduced earlier, to start a conversation about the results that we found in the report. So I'd like to start with you, Joanna, and ask you to give your reflections for a few minutes on the findings in the report.
Thanks so much, Corinna, and thank you to the Minister who is gone now, but that was an excellent discussion. Again, I'm Johanna Ralston, and I'm the CEO of the World Obesity Federation, and I want to also really thank you and the Global Nutrition Report for focusing so much on overweight and obesity as very much part of this holistic issue. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks. Also, as you can hear, my voice is a little bit weak, so if I need to stop for a minute, I'll just let you know. So I think the report is really impressive, and I think, as you say, Corinna, there's a great deal in there there's actions to take, and that's encouraging. When I was reading the report, I was reminded of a Swedish word called lagom. Lagom means it has its roots in sort of the word for team, and there being enough for everybody on the team. And there's a Swedish saying, lagom är bäst, lagom is the best, and it's a very Swedish sort of kind of a concept of there being enough. And what we're missing here is food systems that are lagom, that have enough for everybody. What we have instead are sort of not just one dysfunctional food system, but a few different colliding food systems that have different incentives and don't serve people as they should. So lagom is what we're looking for, I think. So the good news, I think, from the report is that there is much more data than we've previously had, policies that we know work and can be implemented more widely. Political will is stronger, and I think there's many things to be encouraged about. The issue of silos is one that plagues us all across health, including in NCDs, including in obesity. And I think inconsistent funding and delivery is also a problem, and absence of data in selected areas. Undernutrition and overnutrition share many of the same drivers, including being the product of, as I said, these food systems that don't work for their populations. So I think that the sort of the commodification of food. I'm going to take a sip of water if you don't mind. So I think that recognizing that they're really this two sides of the same coin, and that's what's needed is integrated food systems is the way forward. But it's a challenge because of the incentives that we have in place. So how do we break down silos in food systems, in undernutrition, in overnutrition, in malnutrition in all its forms? Well, we know that multi-sectoral policies and multi-sectoral actions are the answer to many of these issues, but I can say that saying the word multi-sectoral action in public will not excite people, will not invigorate people, will not galvanize people. It's a term that we as policymakers love and use, but it lacks public resonance, and I think that's an important point. We haven't, how do we make that leap to recognizing the necessity of multisectoral action, and yet communicating it in a way that resonates with the public. And even with people who are not food policy people like ourselves, who may not necessarily appreciate or understand, but have an important role to play in addressing this. So I think that's the first piece. We need a new nutrition narrative with people at the center. I think people at the center is the way to get over that challenge of multisectoral action by framing it through lived experience, by learning from lived experience. And again, if you've not read the report that Corinna has produced with her team around lived experience in food policy, I commend it to you. It's a really, really good first step. Understanding how does this translate into the real world, you know? So I think the lived experience piece is essential and can be a driver and also create demand, because we need to see greater political demand, and that needs to have a stronger grassroots and public-facing element. So the nutrition narrative can also help support the business and finance case for investment, and for progress we need to collaborate around the win-wins. How can we say we're not coming with another set of asks, with another set of requirements, but rather we're investing in measures and interventions that have double and triple wins. Framing through children is critical because that is the best example of where multisectoral action is needed and works across sectors that are unrelated. And you cannot have what we call the tyranny of the single solution, where one solution is going to solve everything, because that sets that solution up not to succeed. For example, sugar-sweetened beverages tax is a wonderful intervention. It's probably universally needed, but to say that's the only way we're going to address obesity, for example, is not going to succeed. It needs to be working in concert with some minimum number of other interventions. Cities are also a really important place where action can be accomplished, where you can see results because you're working with all sectors more closely together. But cities are also not the panacea. I think that we need to bring along rural populations as well, of course, particularly in the comprehensiveness of the nutrition approach. And city success does not always translate into country success. We've seen a bit of that in Mexico, for example. And so it's very important to understand how we can bring those together. The 9 targets are encouraging, but as you said, the reality is 100 countries have zero progress on the targets, and for the obesity target, there's zero countries have accomplished much. So I think back to kind of the notion of lagom. David Nabarro said nutrition is everyone's business and no one's responsibility. Nutrition needs to be everybody's responsibility. There needs to be shared accountability. And then we'll have a nutrition system that is lagom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So a lot has been said already, so I'm going to take Corinne's challenge and the challenge of the report to say, given what we do know, why is progress not better? So Save the Children does 3 things. We focus on making sure kids don't die unnecessarily before their 5th birthday. We focus on making sure all kids get a high-quality education, and we protect kids, especially in conflict. Now, that might make you think that we do health, education, and violence. Malnutrition is fundamental to everything that we do because it cuts across all of those for the reasons people have said. Minister Burt talked about the challenges in the UK being especially for deprived, marginalised families. And that's true, that's what I see in the work we do here, but it's even more so globally. You know, when we look at the trends, which are depressing, despite some small gains, if you look where we need to get to, we need a 10-fold increase in progress if we're really going to help the bottom 20%. So the challenge is big, but if you're serious about helping the kids, the families left behind, which is what we all said we were going to do, you need a 10-fold increase in effort and progress for those families. I think the second thing to focus on is the level of ambition. And I really like the way this report is saying, we know what to do, we can do it, but we need to do it. We need to get on with it. So the Tokyo Summit, I think, is a really critical moment. It's an opportunity because it's going to bring all the players together in a way that we need to get beyond these silos, to get people working together. The challenge is a lot of the current commitments to action expire just before that summit. So making sure that we actually get new commitments, that we get new action coming out of that becomes really critical, and that's difficult. It's a difficult environment to try and get people to make new commitments and do things, but we have to do that. And we know there are things that work, you know, in addition to the ones that were cited. I mean, I've seen programs that we fund, or that we do in northern Nigeria, funded by DFID, where we've actually managed to reduce stunting by 8% through breastfeeding, through cash, through counselling for families, behaviour change. That is a huge shift in an area where before there hadn't been any progress in decades. And now we've got the state government working with us, putting 4.5 million of their own money into supporting that programme. So we know there are things that can work. We can scale them up. We need to be committed and we need to work together to do that. I think the third thing, building on the message about working across issues, working across silos, WASH, water, sanitation, hygiene, is something people don't talk about enough. But you live in Bangladesh as I did, WASH is absolutely central to making progress, whether it's obesity, whether it's hunger. We need to try and get people working together in a way that they might in a humanitarian setting, but they don't tend to day to day in the way we think about these things. Another example of getting people to work together, pneumonia. Pneumonia is the greatest child killer out there right now. It's not malaria, it's pneumonia. Between now and 2030, 11 million kids are going to die of pneumonia. But we know a quarter of those kids will not die if we get them better nutrition. So we know, again, this is something that really works, that avoids complications of other diseases, other illnesses. So just underlining how important it is to get health professionals working with others to try and understand what's going on and trying to get beyond silos. I think a fourth thing that comes across very strongly in the report, but bears repeating, is the challenge of working in conflict and fragile states. As you say very politely, it's disappointing that this is a new challenge, but it is very, very significant. This is where we see the toughest challenges. And it's both where we see the highest rates, but it's also where it's hardest to do anything. Most humanitarian programming is 6 months to a year. I was looking at some of the work we're doing in Somalia earlier this year. Last year, big push on Somalia. This year, everything's shutting. South Sudan, we have to close feeding stations. And yet, the people are still hungry. The families still need it. But that's the way the international system works. And they don't have governments who can afford to do it themselves. Yemen, people suddenly, thankfully, thanks to the UK leadership, are beginning to notice. We think 85,000 children have died in Yemen from hunger. And we've got the data to back that up. That is horrific and unnecessary. And obviously the long-term solution is to end the conflict. But in the meantime, what can we do? So one of the things we're doing is we're trying to actually investigate new approaches. Because the other challenge, of course, is by the time the kids get wasted and they turn up in hospital, it's really expensive. And it takes a long time. And by the time the children reach that stage, quite often, you've got brain damage for life. Or some of them won't make it. So one of the things we're looking at is how much more can you do at the community level? We know that 20% of kids with severe acute malnutrition are the ones who get treated. The other 80%, their families don't get them to the health centre. There may not be a health centre. They may not be able to get there. They may not be able to afford it when they get there. So why aren't we looking harder at community approaches to treating acute malnutrition in the way we have begun to do for malaria, for pneumonia, for diarrhoea? So we're doing some work at the moment in Yemen, in Somalia, in Kenya. We're going to do it in Nigeria, DRC, South Sudan, to try and look at those places where at the moment we're dealing with it as a humanitarian emergency issue, to say, actually, this would be more effective, it would be cheaper, and think of how much pain and suffering it would actually solve. But we think it'll work, and we've got 2 years' worth of research, and we're going to roll that out to continue it, to say, does that work? And then what I hope we can do is bring to people new approaches and say, actually, this is an incredibly effective way to deal with something which we know is very, very difficult. So wait to hear more, and those of you who want to get involved, please do, because we definitely want to do this as a collaborative effort. The final thing I want to do is a shout out for the Sun Network. So I spent several years overseas, Malawi, Bangladesh, places like that, when the Sun Network was just getting off the ground. And it's exactly that idea of bringing people together. And I want to give a particular shout out to the Sun Civil Society Network. That's not just because we host it, but that's because I think it's really, really good. The Sun Network does what we all said at the very beginning. It brings together 3,000 non-governmental organisations, most of them local around the world. It works in 40 countries. And it makes that link between the local community, the local actors, the government, the private sector, the international discussions, And one of the things we've worked on them this year is 13 youth leaders to help exactly that, getting the message, getting the voice of adolescents to their peers to get that to the international leaders. So a shout out to the great work of the Sun Network. Thank you.
Thanks for those remarks. Really interesting reactions there. Can I ask, before going out into the floor, can I just ask a question, Hannah? You said about food systems being the problem, and you named quite a few things that are clearly problematic. But what do you think are the factors, the most important factors that are contributing to this diabolical state of diets around the world?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Apart from that food systems aren't fit for purpose.
Well, I mean, I'm not gonna dodge the question, but say, as with everything, there's no one thing. I would love it if there was that single solution that we could just focus on fixing, and then all would be well. I think it's that there is no one food system on some level, but certainly the profit incentive has done a lot of harm. But that's not to say that in and of itself inherently a private sector involvement and benefit in a food system is a bad thing. It's just the way things have evolved and developed. So I think that's certainly been driving the obesity epidemic, of course. Subsidizing, it gets complicated though, because I think it has its roots in subsidies of agriculture, agricultural subsidies and the types of the loss of diverse crops. So that's in and of itself going to be a very complex issue. So I think then time is such a huge factor here, and I was so struck by what you said. It's that we have such a short-term view to undernutrition, and in some ways such a long-term problem around overnutrition, and to undo those, to change the system that's driving overnutrition and the system that's contributing to or trying to address and not succeeding with undernutrition, particularly in humanitarian settings, that the time needs to get aligned, the timeline upon which everybody's working, and that bumps up against political timelines, profit timelines, all of those different elements. So my answer to your question is not a response as much as it is a question of how can we harmonize timelines, harmonize those incentives, both public and private sector. I think that's the reality, and that's, as the minister said, there's certainly some very negative examples out there, private sector, but the reality is there's lots of, there's a very big role that private sector needs to and is playing. And then some of those issues around sort of those maligned incentives, how can we harmonize those better?
Thank you. Thank you. And love your reaction to the question. Yeah, what in your view is causing these really poor quality diets among so many of the world's children?
I think the issue of the breastfeeding and the milk companies has already been mentioned, and I think that is a problem, and that every time you think we're making progress on that issue, it re-emerges. And we put some more research out on that this year based on studies we've done of where, as I say, you think you're beginning to counter it, and then suddenly you just discover different companies, same old practices appearing, and I think that's really important. I think there's also, from the work we do, it's understanding what drives people's decisions. And we know, for example, that women and girls are last in the queue. And some of that is other people making the choices. Some of that is them making the choices themselves. So often pregnant women are not prioritizing themselves when food is short. And so that is a real problem. And that, of course, has the impact on the baby and the impact going forwards. Some of it is cultural. One of the things I love to do in my job is a real privilege, is go and sit in villages and talk to people. So a couple of months ago, I was in Kenya in Bungoma County talking to women and talking to the men as well, the husbands. And we were talking, and there's something I've heard in Malawi and elsewhere as well, there was a real cultural assumption that eggs are something women shouldn't eat when they're pregnant. And actually it's a great source of protein, of course, but the assumption is, no, you shouldn't, and it's bad. But you can work with those communities, you can help explain to them why. There were chickens running around everywhere. And so if you can actually work to change people's understanding and explain why, you can actually make quite fast progress on things like that. But it's understanding, if you just go in and say, well, you must eat this, 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 it's not going to work. You have to understand where people are coming from and why.
Thank you. Well, we'd love to hear from you. and invite some questions from the floor for us. Please wait for a microphone to come to you. There's a question at the front here. And if you could just say your name and your institution if you have one before your question. Please try to keep the questions as brief as you can, please. Thank you.
Jonas, Policy Director at the Soil Association. Our Food for Life programme is in half the schools in England changing menus, and we've recently produced a State of the Nation report on children's food in the UK. I was very struck, Corinna, by what you were saying about the findings relating to the UK, the overlapping of obesity and malnutrition, the fact that 69% of packaged foods don't align with a healthy diet. I wanted to ask you whether you felt that we'd got the public health narrative right on childhood obesity in the UK, and whether we're showing the leadership we should on that. The focus is on calories, it's not addressing diet quality, and the fact that 51% of our UK diet is based on ultra-processed foods, compared to 14% of the diet in France, for instance. And perhaps that's leading to action that's exclusively focused on reformulation rather than normalising real food.
Thank you for that question. Are there any others at this initial?
Philip James, London School of Hygiene. I've worked for a few decades on malnutrition and obesity. I congratulate you, Corinna, on the new analyses of data, which are very helpful. But it seems to me that you've highlighted the crisis. I haven't heard much from the Minister, and you've touched on it, but what about the power game? Where's the power? When we're trying to change international diets through WHO and FAO, we discovered when Gro Harlem Brundtland, the head of WHO, went to FAO and put out the new agenda, 140 ministers of agriculture forbade the FAO from doing anything. And they were heavily lobbied, and I was involved in a lot of that, by the major farming companies, food companies, global, huge concerns. And it seems to me that we need to understand the power game. And given the current crisis meeting on climate change, I hope that we can have a complete regearing. It would be very nice to hear whether you have plans to link the sort of fundamental demand of sustainability with a new strategy for food and what it fundamentally requires on the origins of the food chain.
Never one to ask a question which isn't fundamental and large, so thank you very much for that question. Can I take one more question?
Hiya, thank you very much. The report is brilliant. Dan Jones from WaterAid. Gwen, you mentioned in your comments that water, sanitation and hygiene wash is often ignored or neglected. Why, in your opinion, is that? And how can we change that?
Thanks for those questions. If we start with the last one first, if you could react, and also, I know you wanted to respond to that too.
Thanks, Dan. It's not easy, right? Because, as you know, you and I have talked over the years, and it's something we've been trying to tackle for many, many decades. There's kind of Jan Egeland's view that nobody wants to talk about toilets, when nobody wants to talk about poo, and all these things are really quite difficult. It's also one where I find even health people thinking that's a separate issue. So people very, very much work in silos, which is why I'm stressing we need to work across a piece. Sometimes dealing with WASH is specialist, and obviously WaterAid does it really, really well. So again, I think the key is to work in consortia. So, no one organisation can do everything. No one ministry in a developing country can do everything. Working across ministries, working across organisations on the ground is is countercultural still. But that's the fundamental part of the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, is that we should be coming together. And again, there's been a lot of innovation in recent years about how we do this. I mean, again, we get it right in a humanitarian setting. I was in the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh 3 weeks ago. We've had nearly 1 million people in refugee camps. We have water. We have sanitation. We have hygiene education going on. Will we still have it 5 years down the line? Or will people forget about it and move on? So I think it is very much people understanding just how fundamental it is. And there's great research, again, I really do think data is our friend, looking at things like, Bangladesh and obviously the brilliant work of ICDDRV, all sorts of things, trying to get the data out there about how fundamental it is. And I think, Karine, you were the one who said there's no magic silver bullet on nutrition, and that's the challenge. Everybody wants a silver bullet. Some people just want to do sanitation. India's been pushing sanitation as the answer. Other people are pushing micronutrients. It's not, it's everything together. And what I love about the report is trying to bring the obesity and the hunger malnutrition side of it together to see how much those issues are linked, which certainly when you're talking about urban slums, in many developing countries, are incredibly linked.
So I'm going to just respond a little bit to Phil James's comments and say, because I'm then going to hand that over to you. But interesting, I think, speaking about the power dynamics. So the G20 just met, as we all know, and they had their working group on health, had been focused on childhood obesity. And actually, the health ministers, if you look it up in November, issued a quite ambitious statement or sort of, program or call for action around childhood obesity, which was encouraging because, yes, there are ossified institutions that are creating barriers, but I think childhood obesity has a certain resonance that's able to potentially get past some of that. And so we're certainly, as World Obesity Federation and our colleagues, calling for much greater commitment of the G20 moving forward around that issue and seeing what we can do. And there's certainly been talk again of a framework convention on childhood obesity similar to the one on tobacco. Again, is it talk or is it going to materialize into something? And then to the point of triple wins, we'd love to see more. We see climate change as being both a driver of the challenges that are outlined in here, but also some potential opportunities around that, which I think Corinna can also speak to, around addressing policies that address climate change that also have benefits around nutrition, overnutrition and undernutrition. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things we always say to our students here is that politics matters and power matters, and you can never get away with it and away from it. And even though the Global Nutrition Report is a data report, and that's what it is, and that's what it's meant to be, as soon as you start trying to do something with that data, then you hit power dynamics, which are everywhere and need to be negotiated if we're going to get effective change. But I wanted to pick up on this point about the narrative around obesity and around diets. I think in the UK, and I see this in many other countries as well, you kind of get the people who talk about let's eat more healthy food or let's eat more of something or other, and then the people who are talking about sugary drinks and trans fats and salts and they don't really come together. It's almost like you have to be on one side or the other. And I think that's one of the narratives that we're trying to change in this year's report, is saying let's look at both sides of it, let's accept, and that's why I specifically said if you don't have enough nutritious foods, you're at risk of heart disease and cancers and diabetes and so on, and you also at risk of stunting, but then those people are also having a lot of the unhealthy foods. So we have to look at it from a total diet perspective. And I think the calorie argument is very, very obesity focused, and it doesn't get to the fact that people aren't necessarily having enough micronutrients and they're not having nutritious foods. And I think there's a real problem that hasn't been brought together. So in our own small way, we try and bring it together simply through the power of data and bringing those different aspects of together. But certainly there is a need for a better and more holistic narrative about the quality of diets. I would agree with that 100%. So I'd like to ask on the data piece. We highlight in the report about the fact that there's a lot more data being collected, and we highlight the importance of data. And I have to say, as somebody who came into the Global Nutrition Report not being a real data fiend, I was very convinced. I'm stepping down from the Global Nutrition Report this year to let others take over, so I'm stepping down this as of this evening, really. And But I was really convinced by the power of data and how important it is to get it right. But also I was helped with a data analyst, such as Jordan, who's sitting at the back of the room, who's one of our fantastic data analysts, and did a lot of the work that I was presenting, is just how inaccurate a lot of data is, and how that can actually lead to very bad decisions. And so what are the big gaps in data that you think are the most critical and that we most need to fill?
Well, so I guess there's two answers to this for me. I mean, one, it was really striking on your charts. Sorry, I think I've let this drop down too far. It's really striking on the charts just how many countries and how many issues we don't have good data for. You know, and that's, again, often the people left furthest behind, the countries who are struggling most are the ones with the weakest data. So, you know, all of us who are working in areas like that are looking, well, where are other ways to collect that data? You know, we're working in Yemen with a greater proportion of households than the latest demographic health survey. So why aren't we trying to do more to collect that household level data, the data from the kids we're working with, and helping to share that with others? And so that's something we're looking at the moment. The chance of doing a formal survey across the whole of Yemen right now is almost nil. But how much can we collect from those of us who are working on the ground all over the country to try and pull that data together and to try and analyse it? So there's a big push on real-time data feedback. You can do it during mobile phones, you can do all sorts of things to try and get much more data. And some of the approaches are really good about, you know, just things like helping people to understand when a child is beginning to go downhill. You can do just by tracking the child's arm, and you can spot and it can automatically do alert. So you don't have to be terribly sophisticated, but at the same time you're tracking all those individual cases, they're coming together, and you then have a regional or a national data set you can analyse. Data is politics. I mean, if you want to get into power and politics, in some countries, you know, particularly around elections, data gets very skewed and very undermined, particularly when it says things that are not very helpful. So I think that's really important. And again, I think it's bringing together our collective efforts. So, you know, we've worked for a long time on a cost of diet tool, which is now used very, very widely, which is trying to look at these economic barriers for people around the world. And it's used by World Food Programme, it's used by everybody else to try and say what's going on. But one of the things I really like this year is the No Wasted Lives Coalition, which is trying to bring together people who are heavily involved in this area and say, well, where are the research gaps? So rather than what would normally happen is we'd all sit in a corner and think about, oh, there's some gaps here, how do we do some more research? He's trying to say, let's become a clearinghouse for new data research work and let's bring it together, and then let's share that data much more, and let's do more of the peer reviewing that you would normally do in the scientific world that doesn't necessarily happen in areas like this.
Thanks for those
observations. Johanna, do you see any major issues in data?
Yes, lots. But I think I wanted to just say a couple of points. First of all, on the political front, in September 2019, we'll have a UN high-level meeting on universal health coverage. So UHC has a lot of, it's the sort of the, you know, the topic du jour within WHO. And I think that there's an opportunity and a massive need to have better data around how nutrition is, or in most cases is not, addressed in health systems. We at the World Obesity Federation are doing a project called MAPS to try to capture whether and if and how obesity is addressed in health systems. What are the entry points? How is it, you know, how are healthcare providers even trained to do it? Is it seen as a disease? More broadly, though, integrated data, I think to your point, if we're going to be looking at this in a much more integrated and holistic way, the absence of integrated and holistic data is all the more marked. And in fact, we're measuring things and capturing data in different ways. So an integrated approach is sorely needed. I do think that the absence of data can at times be a trigger for advocacy, for calling for more resources. I've certainly experienced that in other areas. And so I think we need to try to turn this around and use this as an opportunity to say, yes, we need much greater investment just in data in general. And certainly from an overweight and obesity perspective in low and middle income countries, we need much better data around this.
Thank you very much. I'd love to take some further questions from the floor. There's a question at the front here.
Hi, my name is Ayunda and I'm from University of Reading. Thank you for the report. It's very enlightening and motivating me to do the diet starting tomorrow. So, when we talk about the processed food, we are talking about the both demand and supply. Demand comes from like our target group, and the supply comes from the company. So I think it's important to work with the company to address this issue. Do you have like an action plan how to work with company? Because if the processed food is everywhere and in the cheaper price, and then we can cook them in a faster way, so we cannot decrease the demand. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that question. And there's a question at the back there.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Tisauzer Pereira. I'm the Head of Nutrition for Action Against Hunger UK. Thank you very much for the report. Thank you very much for highlighting especially all the needs on a healthy diet. Before my question, if I could just mention something about the lack of data and the fact that we forget constantly children under 6 months and children with kwashiorkor on the data, and that when we define wasting, it's still very unclear if we mention children with a low MUAC or not. And that's a big problem in undermining undernutrition, and we should pay attention to this. But my question is on the fact that international organizations like mine or like Save the Children, with whom I worked before, have been fighting against undernutrition for decades, and we do see the rise in childhood obesity in the countries where we work, but we are struggling to find our place, apart from agricultural policies maybe and food security or livelihood, but in pure nutrition, we are really struggling to find our place and find our role. So what would be your advice for organizations like ours?
For that question. And there was a gentleman here with a question.
My name's Lawrence Cockcroft. I've worked with the Gatsby Foundation for many years, particularly putting funding into agricultural research. And I'm a bit surprised, especially in your 5 strategies, that you haven't said anything about R&D in research in food, because there's a lot that can be done in relation to improving the nutritional value of crops that are already grown well before they're processed. And although some work is being done in that, it would be easy to argue that not enough. So wouldn't you say, for example, that the consultative group on international agricultural research should make nutrition even more of a priority than it is at present?
Thank you. Yana, would you like to respond to a couple of those points?
Sure. Just a couple of things. So to your point about demand and supply of processed foods, you're absolutely right that we have to work with the companies that are supplying the food, and I think that there's been lots of work done. I think we need to have a level playing field and an agreement to be working more closely and in more transparent and open ways. That's critical. We also have to understand what I would say, actually, the single most useful factor I would say is trying to really lobby shareholders of the companies that are producing this food. That's where a lot of the demand comes from for perpetuating this, although, again, agricultural subsidies play a huge role as well. So we need to sort of offset the cheapening of food and the lack of availability of diverse crops with a kind of a counter movement around that. So those are some high-level upstream activities. In terms of how that translates into what you can do, just get involved in calling out companies to be more health enabling and health promoting. There are many people in those companies who want that very much, but are sort of pulled in these different directions by the structure of their companies, the way profit works, and even the food system that it supports. So I think that's just, to understand it's complicated, but within that, advocacy and activism can play a really meaningful role, and so please keep doing that. And to the point of what can Action Against Hunger do, I do think that there's something, and again I'm speaking really just a bit off the cuff here, but
what is the nutrient quality of the food, and how can we diversify that? That's such a critical piece, and it's hard and it's complicated, but it needs to start with you and with Save the Children and with all the groups that are there in the front lines on this. I think that's really essential. So thank you.
Thanks. To pick up on the point about agriculture, in 2017, the Global Nutrition Report focused much more on other sectors, and that was what it was focused on last year, so we did a bit less of it this year, because we had so much more intense data. And absolutely, that the whole idea that we can't solve this problem without agriculture sorting itself out is just not going to happen. So the food systems approach, that really needs to start from people, but then extend back all the way into the food system, right all the way back to agriculture is fundamental. And sustainability is also a fundamental part of this issue as well. So it's not something that we highlight this year, but last year we had a whole section on that, and thanks very much for highlighting it. And just on the point about what you do when you're facing undernutrition and obesity is rising, in 2015, the Global Nutrition Report coined a term, double duty action. And it's an area that I work on. I'm just working on a paper, and I've written, something came out with the World Health Organization that I worked on last year, and a paper will be coming out hopefully next year, which will cover this. And the idea is that there are the existing platforms, such as social protection, such as agricultural development programs, such as schools, such as health services, in which undernutrition is being addressed. And actually, if you look at those programs, there are ways of building in actions which can actually help reduce the risk of obesity, and we're not doing that right now at all. We're just acting in these separate spaces. And I think, unfortunately, there are cases, and this is, of course, unintentional, completely unintentional, where lack of attention to the nutrition reality is meaning that people are at increased risk of obesity and diet-related NCDs because those actions aren't being taken. And it's not rocket science. So I think I'm a big advocate for this double-duty action approach. So we'll take a round of questions. There was a question here. Yes. Oh, sorry, it's okay. There's someone else got the mic. You go ahead, and then I'll come to you.
Okay, thank you. Christopher Twist from Save the Children UK. On the data point, can you hear me? Okay, it's a bit of background noise. Yeah. On the data point, you mentioned that it's one of your 5 critical actions, and that's great. It's really come through strongly in this report. And as we know, we have that fantastic piece of work from the World Bank Investment Framework on nutrition-specific interventions, and that's made a huge difference in terms of galvanizing donor support for nutrition. To what extent would you say? To what extent would you agree that an equivalent for nutrition-sensitive interventions is absolutely essential for us to reach some of those targets and drive the collective? Sorry, that's not my voice. Shall I start again? You got that?
That was fine. Could we have another microphone over here, please?
Right, Chris, let's see if I can get... I think I've got it better. Hello, I'm Louise Meike, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at World Cancer Research Fund International. I'd be curious to know from the panel to what extent or how you see perhaps the role of human rights, and in particular perhaps children's rights, as a vehicle to help to spur action on promoting healthy diets.
Good evening. My name is Julius, and I am a nutrition officer from the Nutrition Council in the Philippines. You mentioned in your presentation about multi-sector actions in cities are growing. I'm just particularly interested, could you give specific examples of policies or actions in cities that are providing progress in improving nutrition, especially in developing countries? Because I believe in developing countries, we do not really see that cities has a very huge contribution in improving nutrition, especially in mobility, on transport. We're not looking into these things and how this thinks could be an improving factor for nutrition, especially obesity?
Thank you. I'll take a couple more questions. I think there's one right at the back there.
Paul Newnham from the Sustainable Development Goal 2 Advocacy Hub. Thanks for the report. It's always a wealth of information. I suppose when I come at this, I'm looking at how do we use that information to drive change. And I see that it basically builds a case that we've got a big problem. We know what we should do. The environment's right for doing it, but it's not happening. And so we're just going to keep banging that drum. What I would like to know is what are the things that we can do to change this trajectory? Because I understand the critical steps, but I'm still not actually seeing here's some action that we need to do, or here's something that we need to really shift and change this year. And otherwise these numbers just keep going. So is it, where do we start in amongst these critical steps? And what helps unlock something else? And I'm keen to hear a non-political answer as well, like just even if it misses some step in the way, how are we going to get moving?
I'll take some questions.
About nutrition sensitive and specific and Christine Oslo. Yes, thanks, Chris. For those of you who aren't say geeky about the financing frameworks, the World Bank has put out a report saying we need $7 billion to invest more in nutrition. The challenge is that is frankly the minimum, and actually what we need is far more than that. But again, you're down to the politics of it. If nobody wants to say we need a gazillion, because that just takes it immediately off the table and everybody's scared. So I think the challenge for all of us, and partly answering your question, to me there's something about saying we know what to do, but more than that, we're doing it in many places around the world, and it is achieving progress. So come back us and help us to expand those programs. And what we are seeing is more and more developing countries, which is obviously my area, coming in behind programs and saying, if you show me something that works and I can scale, I will happily finance it and scale it up. Not everywhere. And some governments are still saying, oh, this is too difficult, I've got everything else to do, which is where I think the World Bank's Human Capital Project, the Minister mentions is important, of trying to reverse that idea that human development is not a good investment. Because too often it's thought, bridges, roads, they're a great investment, I can do the rate of return analysis for them, but trying to say human capital is a great investment. So there's a lot of things we need to do. We're also ourselves trying to tap into a new set of people who care about this. And it's partly the rights issue, but who was saying, I feel a bit powerless in terms of trying to solve something because it's too big. And what we're saying to them is, look, we have things up and running, other people have things up and running in countries, try and match people to things they might want to do in a way that doesn't get them into having to figure out what a whole national nutrition strategy looks like, because that's far too much for them. But there's a lot of individuals, a lot of philanthropists who want to do it if you can make it simpler for them and care deeply about nutrition as an issue, which is A, wrong, and B, that they know is a great investment. I think on the child rights side, just more generally, well, on the human rights side of it, I've got 2 teenage boys who, they've so got the idea on cancer and passive smoking that they get offended if they walk past somebody smoking in the street and they say, stop it, you're killing me. Now, maybe a slight overreaction, but there is something of kids understanding that this matters to them and their future, and getting them to be able to speak up and use their voice. And, it's a lot of change has happened in the UK over the years by convincing kids what needs to happen. But again, as a parent, it isn't as simple as your child telling you you're parenting wrong, because that's not very nice either, right? So understanding why parents are finding it expensive. The data that was put up around the UK, it is expensive. Many of those low-income families are struggling. They're very time poor. So actually, it's understanding for those households what can be done and how can help. But I think definitely giving kids a voice, talking about the right to actually have a healthy diet, because it's an investment in their own long term, I think is quite important.
Yeah, thank you. I think building on that, I would say, having young people as advocates is critical. particularly if you're going to be doing a rights framing around childhood obesity, which is, I think, ripe for it. And to your point, I know we want something that's not just politically expedient, but I see this as a political window that's opening that we ought to be prepared for and trying to drive through. That I kind of mixed my metaphors there, sorry about that. But I think, at World Obesity and working with others, we have trained adolescent advocates, which is great. People who've experienced, young people who've experienced obesity. And they're great and they're wonderful champions. And so take it away from the grown-ups, bring it to the young people who are really passionate about that. I would really build on that. I think the other thing I would say related to, so that's to your point, Louise, and I do see it a bit as the new tobacco in terms of it's where tobacco was about 15 years ago, ready for a framework convention. I really believe that. Whether it happens or not, whether that's the best mechanism, we'll see. But I do think it's ready for it. And then I think beyond that, it is that public-facing side of it around the SDGs. I think there's an opportunity to do more of that and have young people drive it. I think we're seeing amazing activity from young people. So I would say, again, it's the same answer for that. And to cities in low and middle income countries, it's frustrating. There's not enough great evidence. There's anecdotal evidence, but to your point, that needs to be a priority. There's action going on. There are some, Bloomberg is funding some interesting activities that are starting to show results, but they do risk being single silo results that we want to be able to make sure are comprehensive. And that is happening as well, but I think you make a good point. I don't have a great answer to that, but I acknowledge your point, and we'll work towards trying to get better evidence from cities in low and middle income countries.
Thanks. Yeah, just to pick up on the cities point, there are well over 100 cities now signed up to the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, and also other Partnership for Healthy Cities, which is Bloomberg's Cities for Changing Diabetes, which is around diabetes, and some other city initiatives that are very relevant to nutrition, but they're not kind of about nutrition. So if you look at the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, a lot of those countries, a lot of those cities are taking action on urban agriculture. It's a typical place to start. But nobody's actually saying, okay, let's measure the nutritional outcome of this. They're just making assumptions that urban agriculture must be good, but you don't actually know what's happening with it. And so that is a classic example where a lot of cities, and some fantastic examples like Antananarivo in Madagascar has won an award recently for its work on agriculture, and that's just one example of these kinds of actions. But what tends to happen is that they don't go far enough and they're not fundamental enough, and we don't tend to see enough fundamental planning of cities, which is about nutrition. So I think there's a lot of small actions that are being taken, and that can be built on, that are really exciting. And the ones that I get very excited about is when they're taking multi-level action, which is why I get so excited by the Amsterdam obesity story, because they're taking action in all levels, and the point made that there's no silver bullet, you have to take lots of action. You can do that at the city level, which I work as vice chair of the Mayor of London's Child Obesity Task Force as well, and that's what we're trying to do, is to bring together all the actions that are taking place and linking them together. And I think to Paul's point as well, it's a big question, but there is so much stuff going on. This is what's so incredible. It's like you said this as well, there's a huge amount of effort out there. I didn't show the data on financing from the report, but a lot more people are putting more money into it. It's not enough, but there's more and more money going in there, and there's more effort, there's more action, there's more policy. And so why is it not all adding up to change? And I think it's a question of looking at everything that's going on already, and what's the missing piece? And I know it sounds very vague, but I still think that it's a mindset issue, that unless you have the right mindset, you're not taking the right action. And so we don't have a lot of in previous global nutrition reports we've had a ton of lots and lots of very specific recommendations, and we didn't do that this year. But it's partly because we need to have this fundamental change of mindset. And if everybody takes responsibility, such as the chefs that you work with, for example, along with the people who are working in humanitarian situations, the people who are working in policy, then I think we will begin to see a bigger change. But it takes everybody taking responsibility. And if actually people feel they have responsibility and they can do something, they probably will. So it's hard to dictate from the outside what people should do. It's when people feel they have control and are empowered, they will take some action that makes sense to them. It's a rather irritatingly general answer, but I do think this mindset about a holistic approach, focusing on diet, and everyone taking responsibility is what's needed to make a difference. There were some more questions as well. I saw some hands up. I'll take the question there, please.
Hi, my name is Kate Franks from the Innocent Foundation, and I'd like to thank Gwen for name-checking No Wasted Lives earlier, because we are a member, and we've funded 4 of the research projects that are addressing some of those questions on reducing wasting. Now, we're a relatively new funder to this space, and I find myself talking to a lot of people about why we've chosen to focus on wasting. And what you often hear is people who don't know much about this area don't want to engage because it's an insurmountable problem. And I know that when we read the Global Nutrition Report, we see some really terrifying figures. But we also see that we are making progress, that with an investment of 7 billion, which is doable, if we can get more people involved, more people funding, we can make serious progress towards these 2030 targets. So my question is, what are those good news stories that we can share that encourage people who are not as familiar with this space to get involved?
Thank you. And there was a question at the front here.
I think one of the problems could be also the fact that not everybody agree about what is a healthy diet. Maybe that could be a problem if it's not correctly addressed. And we don't have to go far away. My husband was in hospital recently, a month ago, and he could choose from a menu. And I was quite shocked. It was the first time I was in hospital. He was choosing like a white processed bread with Philadelphia cheese, a Mueller sugary yogurt. There was even the cakes, processed cakes. He could, luckily, was ill enough not to able to eat it, but so he didn't eat for 2 weeks. That was good. But my son was there and asked to eat the cake. He had a bite and put it down, said it's too sugary. 16 years old, coming out from school, and he let it in. And the hospital was very proud of his quality of food, but it's just wrong. It's wrong food. So why is not a nutritionist in an hospital? That is very easy. Or another example is the local authority, my local authority, as a food bank, as anybody else, and they have in their website, please, we urgently needed food items, 10 items, and among them there is long life juice. Why people need long life juice? Tin meat, corned beef, chicken, means tin meat. Tin rice pudding, non-refrigerated sponge pudding in a food bank here in London, local authority. I think that if we don't agree what is a healthy diet, it's a bit like the problem it was addressed about the calories versus qualities. It's not a problem here in London to fill up the stomach of people. So why that is still such a problem?
Thank you. There was a question at the back.
Hello, Kath Ellis. Oh no. I'll power through. Kath Elliston here from the Jamie Oliver Food Foundation. I was just wondering if there's anything that really surprised you about this year's report?
I'll pick up the question on good news stories. I mean, I've mentioned a couple, but I think I think there are loads, and I think, as you say, for those of us who work in development humanitarian, you kind of go through a journey, right? You start out, you're terribly keen, you're terribly kind of wide-eyed, and then you realise the reality of what you're doing, and you go through this slump of like, oh my goodness, how on earth are we going to do anything? But what keeps you grounded is that things are changing. You know, we have halved child mortality since 1990. We can make progress on all these issues with the right interventions. Yes, more resourcing from a variety of sources. You know, we did some work around, it's 7 billion, but, you know, how much do we spend on the World Cup? You know, all these things, if you put them in context, it's not actually that much money. So I think it is exactly, as you say, getting lots of stories out. And I think what's really interesting is how many governments around the world are now championing this. I mean, Indonesia is about to do a massive campaign on malnutrition, both the obesity side and the hunger side, as something led by the president as fundamental to Indonesia's future, and that's fantastic, and we'll happily work with them, and I'm sure everybody else will. So I think there's lots of good news stories to share. I think the other thing I would just add, though, on the research data side, is also being honest with ourselves where it doesn't work, because it's too easy to get carried away saying, oh, it's great, we know all the solutions. Some of these things are incredibly difficult, and the reason we're doing this work in the communities in fragile states, you know, the people that I was talking to, well, surely we know that. Actually, we don't know if you can really, at a community level, weigh all those different issues on very hard-pressed families at the same time, and actually have enough understanding about can you treat kids with severe acute malnutrition at that level without somebody else or something else struggling. You know, when I was in the Rohingya camp, sorry to come back to it, but it's a pretty moving thing to go and do. We're picking out in the feeding stations the kids underweight, and they're getting high-energy biscuits, they're getting extra support. And you know what happens? The family then take the very precious rice, pulses and oil they've got for the rest of the family, and they don't give that to the child, because they've got something special for the child, and they don't realise you need to put it together. So I would say that we need to very, very much shout about the good news stories, do further research, but also be honest when what we think should work doesn't work, so we can course correct and get it right.
I think just the one comment I would say to what was surprising to me, and it shouldn't have been surprising. There's actually a lot. I thought it was a terrific report, and I just again commend Corinna for that. I know there was a large team, but I think her vision helped drive a lot of this. But the funding, the fragmentation of the funding is disappointing, because the development and nutrition funding is really just capturing mostly stunting and that piece, and we're sort of still having these parallel tracks. And then again on the overweight and obesity, that hasn't even been tracked. There's not a purpose code for it in OECD terms. And if you know the numbers, the way I've been working in NCDs for a really long time, but you know, for ODA funding, NCDs capture somewhere at best, the most they've ever captured is about 3% of all overall global health funding. That's for NCDs, which, you know, drive about 70% of deaths each year. And so within that, obesity and overweight are obviously there, and they're driving some of these diseases, but it's not captured, and it's certainly, the funding is woeful. And that needs to change, but the two need to come together, and that's a task, but I think it can be done. So I would say that's the key. I appreciate what you said about being fed in the hospital. I happened to be I went to the hospital this summer, and I happened to live right next to the French border, and I got very French food, and it was just, you know, very creamy things, and not so much processed, but certainly not what was going to be useful for me at that time. I wound up not eating much either. I'd love to hear from Corinna on that, how that might work through her work with the Obesity Commission here in London. So I think those are just my remarks.
Sure. I mean, on the healthy diet, there's a lot of disinformation out there about healthy diet, and there's a lot of people who try and say, oh, it's so complicated, it's so complicated. It's not actually that complicated. And we show clearly in the report about the elements of the diet which are linked, which are good for health. So from a scientific perspective, of course, there'll be evolution in science. Nutrition is a relatively young science. And we haven't known about micronutrients for really that long at all in the grand scheme of things. But we do know what the elements of a healthy diet is. The complexity of it comes in that there's a lot of special interests in the system who are trying to say that, you know, this is healthy or that is not healthy, and that really complicates matters. But the main issue, I think, is that we need to understand it better from people's, and we've talked about this issue about lived experiences and kind of child rights and putting people at the centre, which is an approach that I advocate myself and indeed at the Centre for Food Policy, which is to understand how people experience the food around them. And to understand how that influences and the reality of their lives, and particularly if they're in deprived circumstances, and how that interacts with the environments around them, and that they may interpret from that what is healthy and what is not healthy. For example, if you come from a situation of deprivation, having a child that is a healthy weight, you might interpret a healthy weight as being overweight, because you are just very happy that your child has enough. And that's something that comes from inside of here. So it's no good for someone like me coming and saying, oh, you've got to understand the reality of people's lives much better in order to try and to fix that, to alter that situation. In terms of what was surprising, it's a great question. And actually for me it was about the micronutrient data. I didn't talk about it very much there, but we have a whole section on micronutrient data. It's really shocking how little we know. We do have good data on intake in the UK, and I showed some of that data, but it's really shocking how poor our data is on micronutrient deficiencies and how that interacts with other forms of malnutrition. And we sort of have this anemia thing, because and even it's not even an iron deficiency anemia, and that's also problematic. But just how little we really understand about micronutrient deficiencies, and so we really need to understand that better and to highlight that issue better among all populations across the world. So that was something that I hadn't just been fully aware of, and that I learned through the report. But the other thing through writing the report that was maybe surprising is the wrong word, but how difficult it was to balance the fact that there has been progress, but there's also been no progress. So, how do you capture that? How do you capture the fact that there's a ton of stuff going on, that there's so much more that we know that we didn't know before, that there's all these actions that are being taken that are highlighted that sometimes have really rapid and positive results, and sometimes they're sustained over a longer time and they have positive results. How do you mesh that together? How do you kind of package that message of there has been progress, but also there hasn't been progress, and without wanting to make people think, oh, it's all so bad, I'm just going to go away and stick my head in the sand and give up on it, but also not to give the impression that it's fine, we're doing fine now. I mean, at the main launch in Bangkok last week, I presented the financing data, and someone came up to me after and said, but you said something good about financing. That's not the impression we want to give. We want to make sure it's all really bad. So we're convincing people to give us more money. So, it can be quite difficult to get that message right. So it was quite surprising how hard it was to balance those two sides. But I'd like to come back to you and come back to this issue about, we've been talking about healthy diets and different forms of malnutrition and wasting and obesity and kind of bringing it all together. Do you think there are some fundamental things that can happen? And we know that we need lots of things to happen, and it's not a silver bullet. But you've talked very eloquently about your experience in humanitarian situations and wasting and severe acute malnutrition and really acute malnutrition situations. And we're talking about breaking down silos between different forms of malnutrition, and you've mentioned about bringing it together as well. But are some actions that you can see, and they could be political actions, they could be governance actions, but what are the one or two things that you think could actually help us take more of a unified approach to addressing these different forms of malnutrition in the context that you're familiar with?
So it may sound too bureaucratic, but I'll explain why it's important, is actually to have national strategies that bring these different elements together. Global level analysis and action is good, but you need to break it down into the country context and then below that. And that's where you begin to address these cross-cutting challenges of how much is the double burden, the triple burden, what's going on in that particular country context, and who can do what. And actually in having some of the countries where they are putting in place those national costed strategies that also look at where the different funding can come from, where support in kind can come from, that's where you begin to see action going forwards. And as I say, Indonesia's on the brink of doing something around this, Nigeria's beginning to do something around this, because I think that then helps to say the reality will be a jigsaw of different people doing things, but you need to bring them together, because nobody has all the money and all the solutions. I do think we need more money, and I do think that is going to be important. And I think, as I say, continuing to make the case that this is a really essential investment. And again, different messages work in different contexts, but the whole message around the first 1,000 days has been quite powerful, from conception through to the first couple of years of a child's life, that if you don't get it right in those couple of years, that is a lifelong impact. And if you're a finance minister or economist, we can talk about loss of productivity. You know, if you're more into education, we can talk about how that affects that. We can talk about health. We can talk about livelihoods. We can talk about rights. But finding a way that appeals to different audiences, that first 1,000 days is so critical. And I think the last thing I would say is absolutely grounding it in people. So you do a national plan, but then you take it right down to the reality of what families, communities are dealing with and the local solutions. Because this is not something that you can just mandate will happen and suddenly it'll be fixed. And I do really like this idea that a healthy diet is a core message, because whether you're people who are misunderstanding that eggs are bad, or whether you're people in the UK who are saying, well, as long as I hit the calorie target, it's fine, that is a very, very core message to understand. But it's also accepting in some places actually having enough food would be a really, really good step. So it is a healthy diet, but in some places there is just not enough food around, so you need to do both together.
Thank you. And one of the good news things in the report is that we find, and this is WHO data, that so many more countries have nutrition strategies. I mean, it's almost like 100% coverage now. And we also find that, I think it's 81% of countries have more than one nutrition target. And that just wasn't the case a decade ago. So that's one of the good news stories that we highlight.
Sure. Okay. So I guess I would answer that question a couple of different ways. As with everything complex, there's often one landmark issue that everybody owns and nobody owns. In cancer, in non-communicable diseases, it was actually cervical cancer. It was a great entry point to have the development communities and the NCD communities and the women's and the vaccines and the children, these different communities come together and to try to get some ownership and common goals around that. And so it's sort of figuring out within all of this, what are a few of those everybody owns, nobody owns issues that you can use to coalesce action, because everybody has a bit of desired, requirement to move forward. I mean, from my perspective, childhood obesity is one of those, but I think they're equally very beneficial and potentially promising issues on the undernutrition side. It would be interesting to take that forward. I think having a sane, transparent mechanism around the private sector's role is really key, and it's difficult. But I know that I have been, as many of my colleagues have been, the recipient of sort of a lot of criticism for having conversations with the private sector, which, some warranted, but a lot of it we need to get beyond that, and how do we? So I think that's another piece. And then I think, to your point, how do you operationalize lived experience? I think lived experience is key. How do you turn that into action and ensure that? And I think some of that comes through governance. So I hope that it's great to hear that there's national nutrition plans. I hope they have people with lived experience on those committees. Sometimes they do, and that's great.
Thank you very much. More questions from the floor, if there are. Yes, there's a question here.
Hi, my name is Kimberly Neve, and I'm from the University of Westminster on the Global Public Health Nutrition course. Thank you for everything so far. I wanted to talk about food manufacturers because they always get such a bad rep, rightly so, actually, I think. And it was Jamie Oliver that made me realise it's a little bit pointless to be angry at them the whole time. We need to play on their level a little bit more. So I'm actually quite interested in initiatives that have worked or that you think could work that aren't so much punitive, but are more incentives and incentivizing, so that, because it's all about money, are there ways that we can get food manufacturers to make things healthier without imposing a tax, for instance?
This is going to be the last round of questions, so if anybody has anything. Yes, there's a question there.
Hi, my name is Simon Starling from Concern Worldwide. We mainly work in fragile and conflict-affected states, so I was interested in what Glenn was saying about the the effort, the 10 times the effort to reach the most vulnerable, reach the bottom 20%. Our analysis says very similar stuff, that donors actually aren't investing in the countries with the highest malnutrition burdens. So if you have any concrete suggestions on how to sort of break that down with 12 years left until we have to achieve the NGGs there, that'd be great.
Thank you. Was there a question back there? Yeah.
Hi, Anna Isaacs from the Centre for Food Policy. I just wanted to go back to politics for a second and ask what, if any, our responsibility is in terms of calling out when political decisions are directly undermining efforts to improve nutrition. So just thinking about the UK, our government, as we heard, is saying, and I'm sure doing lots of very positive things, but at the same time decisions are being made that really fly in the face of that. So we know that the rising food bank use in the UK is not an unfortunate accident, it's a result of political decisions, and we know that the famine in Yemen is also being fueled by political decisions. So as public health advocates, do we have a responsibility to be calling out when these things are really threatening our health? Thanks.
Thank you. I think there's a question at the front.
Thank you. Stephen Saby from DFID. Not a question, just as much as a comment, really, in response to a few things we've heard in terms of power and in terms of where we take this from here. And I just wanted to really further emphasise the next Global Nutrition Summit in Japan next year. It feels really quite encouraging. The Japanese are talking about success of the summit being measured, for example, by whether there is the same level of awareness and urgency attached to the fight against nutrition as there is to tackling climate change. So there's a real sense of ambition from the hosts there. I think the other thing that we see as encouraging is the determination that summit should be much better, actually, I'm saying this from the UK government, than the summit that was in London in 2013. So, and what do they mean by that? I think they are really keen to have policy commitments being made that are based on what we now know about what is needed. Whether those are difficult questions about power relations, whatever it is, they are about to kick off a process over the next 6 months to look at what those should be, so that you get a set of policy commitments at the summit which are coherent and based on what's needed, rather than a rush of commitments for the sake of making commitments, if you like. And that the financing absolutely has to be there, but the financing is coming in behind what's needed. So I just wanted to kind of further encourage everyone to engage in that process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just take one more question at the back there.
Hey, thanks. Anne Salter from No Wasted Lives Coalition. We manage a website jointly with UNICEF called The State of Acute Malnutrition. It's been a fascinating process working with them to get some of their data on acute malnutrition in the public domain and seeing that cycle of how once it's in the public domain they feel more accountable and they update it and they, there's a kind of feedback loop there. And I'm really interested, this being your last day working with the Global Nutrition Report, what your experience has been working with all these data sets over the past few years and compiling this report and how that accountability mechanism has changed over the past few years.
Thank you.
A couple of thoughts from me. First, on working with food manufacturers rather than just complaining and being angry with them. I completely agree. There was a comment earlier about the importance of agricultural research. And many food companies are heavily involved in research. So as well as I absolutely agree on CGIAR, it should be far more part of their remit. We have a partnership with GlaxoSmithKline on the health side, where, I mean, again, their employees voluntarily fundraise, support some of the work that we do, because it makes them feel good. But more importantly, we work together on health research in areas where they're committed to it as a public good. And that, for me, is kind of a great example where we have sometimes tough conversations, but you can partner, and they have outstanding R&D that we couldn't possibly match. But we can provide the real-life experience of what's going on, and we can help roll out things they know works in a way that confuses them why people wouldn't automatically do something they've proven works. So I think there's lots of opportunities there. Concern, very happy to have a follow-up conversation. Paul Stephen, I'm sure will be part of it. To credit to DFID, DFID is doing a lot of the fragile conflict states. But again, what we're finding, and part of the reason we launched this new initiative, is so much donor funding is now, it's for health, or it's for education, or it's for social protection. And we've been having good conversations with DFID, with the World Bank over the last year to say, in Yemen, seriously, we cannot operate like this. We're getting kids turning up at the education project we run who are stunted and wasted and need help. We've got a health project over here, we've got cash transfers over here, why aren't we joining them up? And part of the reason, we put some of our own money into it to say we need to join the dots between this. And we've also got donors, not DFID, who are frankly just not willing to pay the costs of working where we are. So I've had to turn down 2 offers from another big international donor in the last week for South Sudan and Congo, because they're asking me to do things which I know we cannot responsibly do properly in those environments for what they're saying they'll pay. And so we've said we would love to help with these people, and the reality is feeding stations and programs will have to shut until those donors are willing to pay the actual cost of operating safely, properly, with quality interventions. So I think it's a really big challenge.
First of all, bravo you for turning down funds and taking that stand, because that's what needs to happen. Because there are times where funding is, it's taken and does more harm than good because it's not there for the long term, and that's a very, very difficult conversation to have with a donor. And I think to sort of address donor fatigue from another perspective, back to Corinna's point, it's double duty, triple wins. What are ways that we can say we're not coming with here's us, the undernutrition, here's us, the over, here's all these different groups, but how can we find those double and triple duty wins? That's one of the key points, I think, around addressing donors and even around some of the other issues that were raised. I think we have to continue to your point about, what do we do when bad things happen, when companies behave badly, when we have to still continue to call it out. That's part of our role as public health advocates. And so we do while trying to find solutions, particularly as we can, solutions that don't make people feel exhausted by being kind of more positive and potentially more efficient. Again, double duty, triple duty wins. And then again, to thank you very much about the Japan event. I think that's really exciting to think it would get the kind of traction we're finally seeing with climate change. And then further on down the road, how do we actually join forces more with the climate change movement and agenda? So it's a nutrition and climate change agenda. That would be a triple, quadruple, quintuple win, and also, I think a really fantastic thing to behold. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I mean, I think speaking to what I would call the policy incoherence when there is a situation where things are being supported and undermined by neighbouring government departments. I think it's very important to understand the motivations behind those decisions and what's happening with that. I mean, I always wonder why it is that our export strategy in this country is promoting the export of foods that we're actually actively trying to decrease consumption of in our own country. And I think that's one of the things that we try and in the report is, again, just limited to the data piece, but at least try and show that malnutrition is universal, and so we shouldn't just be saying it's over there. And I appreciated that the Minister did highlight the universal nature of it, but it's with all of us, and therefore we need to be thinking in a much more coherent way. In terms of the question about my experience of 4 years of working on the Global Nutrition Report, which has been quite a ride for someone like me who is not a data analyst and never claimed to be a data analyst. I've worked very closely with people, and Jess Banzo, and I mentioned I'd like to highlight Jordan's work and his colleagues at the back of the room there, who have done the hard work of drilling down into the data. But in terms of my own sort of personal journey with it, I mentioned before about how I realised just how important data is. In terms of how it can help create accountability, I think that there's a lot of senior level political figures who don't know what the data is showing, and it can be extremely powerful. And I remember in 2016 report when we went and did the Asia launch, which was also in Bangkok, and talking and sitting with the Minister of Health and getting the report out and just showing the fact that stunting had not moved in Thailand for a very long time after this very successful decline in earlier years. And he kind of immediately got on his phone and said, "I think there's a mistake in the data," and was kind of running, kind of nervous about it. And I think that trying to use the report more effectively, and I hope in the future that there is much more done, not just about getting it into the media, but actually having a proper engagement strategy with the data, with politicians at a senior level, can actually help. What was pointed out from the from UK Department for International Development just now can actually help get nutrition much higher up the development agenda, and I think that's absolutely critical. And I've seen instances when that has happened, which is I think very gratifying. Where I get very frustrated and continue to be frustrated around the data focus of the report is the lack of connection with people. It seems very abstract. You're kind of putting this data out there and it's powerful data, but how does it actually really connect with people's lives? And I don't think there's been a single global nutrition report that's talked about qualitative data. And as at the Centre for Food Policy, we mainly do qualitative data, so it's quite interesting, and I think that's a real gap, and I think that the report should at some point just at least take on what can we learn from actually speaking to people who experience malnutrition. That is data. It's just not the same kind of data as the classic kind of numerical data. So I really hope that in the future the report takes that on. So I'd like to end just by asking my panelists here just for their one final, very brief statement to the key message that you'd like the audience to take away with you. Where were we then today?
I feel like we've said so much to you already. I mean, I think the reality is it's so inspiring having so many people in this room who've worked on these issues far longer than I have and are far more expert. And I think the key is how do we bring coalitions together like this to actually make that action happen? I think that's a challenge for all of us of that double duty, if you like.
Thanks. I think to the point about qualitative data and resonating with human beings, that's what those big food companies do very well. They know how to reach people and resonate with them. Why are we not doing that to fight what we don't like them doing? Instead, we're sort of throwing wonky numbers and saying we need to be more multi-sectoral. That's not working, so let's try what they're doing and borrow a page from their playbook. And then kind of the obviousness of it, of healthy diet is the way to address malnutrition. That's a very complex and yet simple statement, and I think let's not get overwhelmed by it and just say that's the key, and that's what can drive all of this coming together. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thanks for those comments, and I would like to end this evening by simply thanking you very much for coming. And I'm hoping that this has provided food for thought for everybody in the room. I'm sorry we don't have hard copies of the report, but you will be able to get them eventually, and I think you've got USB sticks and the executive summary at least. But I hope that you find something in the report that you can think about and go and act on, which is, after all, what we are aiming to achieve. So with that, I'd like to invite you all to join us at a reception down